Congressman, as you look back on that day when a mob of rioters broke into the Capitol building and interrupted you and your colleagues from doing your work, which was certifying the Electoral College results, I'm curious to hear how you're thinking about things now. What are you most grateful of? What are you most, bitter about?
Thank you, Scarlett, for your question. I'm most grateful for the Capitol Police officers and other law enforcement officers that did their best to protect us on that fateful day of January 6th. What I remember is that I was on lockdown with Congressman David Cicilline. And when we realized at some point that not only was there an attack on the Capitol, but that the former president had incited the insurrection, that we started to draft the article of impeachment because there were still another 2 weeks left at that time of the former president being in power. And we didn't know how much crazier he might get. So we wanted to have an article of impeachment out there as leverage to constrain him from doing anything even worse. And unfortunately, even now, he's continuing to perpetuate the big lie that is fueling this political violence. And I call on all Republican officials to stand up and to tell the American people one simple, truthful statement, which is that the election was not stolen.
In retrospect, now that you think about that moment when you were drafting the article of impeachment against Trump, is there anything you wish that you might have done differently or that Democrats might have done differently?
In terms of anything we would have done differently, I think it was completely the right thing to do to draft the article of impeachment, to pass it, and to hold the Senate trial. And when you look at the actual result, it was 57 to 43 in terms of conviction. In any other setting, that would be a blowout. That was not close. But unfortunately, there's a very high bar for removing and impeaching the former president, and it didn't clear that bar. But it was a overwhelming bipartisan vote for conviction.
I think about how there are a number of Republicans who immediately resigned in protest after January 6th, including members of the president's cabinet. But they have since stayed very quiet, and they don't contradict President Trump's assertion, even now, that the election was stolen. What does this tell you about today's Republican Party?
Cowards, all of them. For those who don't stand up, they know that what happened on January 6th was an attack on our nation's capital. It was an attack on our democracy. They know it was wrong. And for those that are silent with this big lie being perpetuated, they are simply cowards. And I simply know that even after more than 1 year with all these audits and investigations, no Republican can still identify who allegedly stole this election, nor explain how it was done. And that's because the election wasn't stolen. The former president got crushed in the popular vote. He lost the Electoral College in a fair and free vote. And that is simply the truth.
If anything, they're now more loyal to President Trump and unwilling to incite him or anger him than ever. We know the Republican Party has changed in the aftermath of January 6th. How do you think the Democratic Party has changed after January 6th?
The Democratic Party continues to believe in truth, in our country, in voting in America. And that's why we are continuing with the January 6th bipartisan committee that does have Republican members on it. This is not a partisan issue. January 6th was an attack on our country. It is something that we should address as a country and make sure it never happens again.
Have you talked to any of those officials who at first turned against President Trump and then later on declined to vote against him in the impeachment trial?
I have not. I have talked to some of my Republican colleagues. It is very disappointing to see the vast majority of Republican members of the House and Senate simply not stand up to the big lie when they know that it is actually a huge, massive lie that's really destroying our democracy.
To what extent do they acknowledge that it's for political survival reasons?
I think if you simply look at their actions, it's pretty clear that that's why they're doing this. If you look at the statements by Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, they're telling the truth. They're explaining why their own colleagues in the Republican Party are not standing up to the former president. It is basically based on cowardice. And I really hope we see more people stand up to the former president.
You talked about the January 6th committee. I know Steve Bannon and others have refused to comply with the committee when it comes to investigating and testifying. People simply ignore the requests or obstruct them. They openly defy any semblance of cooperation. How do you reassure voters who might worry and wonder if House subpoenas actually mean anything anymore?
That's a great question. The former president showed that congressional subpoenas essentially became meaningless because he would litigate all the subpoenas and it would take years and years to get it resolved. For example, on the House Judiciary Committee, we eventually won in terms of getting Don McGahn, a former White House counsel, to come and testify before the committee. But because he chose to litigate the subpoena, it took over 2 years for that to happen. We can't have that kind of delay, and essentially renders these subpoenas meaningless. So I've authored legislation that would change the House rules and allow us to execute our inherent contempt power, which would give us authority to enforce our own congressional subpoenas through fines and even restricting the freedom of the person who's been given the subpoena.
There's a lot of suspicion, a lot of distrust between Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill. I wonder how much more difficult it is right now to reach across the table, let alone work together on legislation now versus before January 6, 2021.
So I've worked with Republicans throughout my career. A number of my bills are bipartisan and have Republican co-authors. However, the last 4 years, there's been a disturbing difference among some of my Republican colleagues, which is that they simply don't adhere to the same reality. So if I'm looking at a banana and they come in and say, no, that's an apple, then we can't really go forward. So if, for example, Republican Representative Andrew Clyde says that January 6th was just like a normal tourist visit, I cannot work with him. He's in a totally different reality. And that is something we're seeing more and more of in the Republican Party. They're becoming radicalized, and they're simply becoming blind supporters of the former president and believing all sorts of lies. And you really can't go forward that way if you don't agree on what's actually true and what are facts.
Right. Alternate facts, alternate realities for the two parties in control. You've said Republican leadership failed to bring down the temperature in the House by refusing to say that the election was not stolen. And this increases the political temperature, the political violence on everyone. Do you ever feel unsafe walking through the Capitol building?
I don't feel unsafe because we have terrific Capitol Police law enforcement personnel, but I am constantly reminded about security. Every time we go on the House floor, we now have to go through a metal detector. That was not something that was in a few years ago. And when we travel or when we're back in the district, I am much more aware of security than I ever was before.
Yeah, well, let's hope that everyone can stay safe. I wonder, a lot of Democrats face long odds to hold on to control of the House in the midterms this November. And so far, 23 House Democrats have decided not to run for re-election. Why are you confident that the House of Representatives is not broken when it seems like many of your peers have given up?
So many of the people that have retired have served many years in Congress. So it's not surprising to me that they have chosen to retire. I do know we are still passing some monumental laws. We passed the American Rescue Plan last year that helped open schools, it helped get people back to work, it helped get shots into arms. And then we passed a major bipartisan infrastructure law that's going to create millions of jobs and rebuild our nation's infrastructure. So we are still getting the work done on behalf of American people. On the issue of political violence, however, there's a great divergence where, unfortunately, you see some members of the Republican Party still promoting the big lie that is fueling and animating this violence.
Final question to you, Congressman Lieu. Could January 6th happen again?
Absolutely. You still see the former president and his supporters continuing to talk about how the election was allegedly stolen. And if you no longer believe in elections, then you no longer have a democracy. And it's very clear that the people who showed up on January 6th were using violence to try to nullify an election. Fortunately, they didn't succeed, but there's no indication that they wouldn't try that again.